Hello, everybody. I'm Caitlin Allen, and love me or hate me, I am your moderator for today. I'm also the VP of Marketing at OpenComp, which is a solution that thousands of the world's fastest growing companies trust to attract and retain and empower the top talent in the market by paying competitively and fairly. Please introduce yourselves in the chat while I give a couple of logistics, and then we'll dive right into a conversation with a panel of incredible experts. We are partnering with the Open Imperative today to host this event, which is a group that launched in March of this year, alongside hundreds of CEOs and investors, to end gender pay inequality in their organizations by 2027. So they want to make sure that everyone is getting paid fairly within 5 years. And we'll talk a little bit about that as we go along that topic. On the logistics front, this webinar is being recorded. We'll share it with you tomorrow. Next week, you're going to get a guide that recaps some of the things that you heard today. And last but not least, we tend to deviate the conversation a lot based upon the questions that we get, so we can make sure that this content is very rooted in what you're here to learn about. So please send those questions, send those comments, and I'll be sure to make sure that they make their way into our conversation. All right, so let's get into our speakers, and then we'll talk about what we're here to discuss. I'm very excited to introduce this panel, and we're going to speak about a really exciting topic. So first up, we have Jose Guadardo. And he has been involved in hiring and recruiting for almost 2 decades at recruiting agencies, which is where he started his career, and then as an operator at companies both large and small. You probably know some of the names: Google, Facebook, Microsoft, Cisco, and then some smaller ones, Dropcam, which became Nest. He's also spent 5 years in VC talent at Andreessen Horowitz. We actually worked together when we were there, and at Y Combinator, and he recently founded Build Talent in 2020. Tradeoffs is next. She is a serial chief people officer, I think it's 4 or 5 times, at numerous startups and mid-stage companies with an equally impressive roster as Jose. And she is also a founding board member and advisor to the Open Imperative, the organization's for Pay Equity Now coalition that I mentioned just a few moments ago, and has over 25 years of experience building and leading people teams, spanning 5 continents and multiple industries. Owen Bitas is the head of product marketing at OpenComp. He's got a decade of experience in product development and marketing for startups and enterprise. You guys see a theme here across a lot of industries. And you guys know Julia Dow very well. She is our VP of compensation services at OpenComp, and works with companies like Airbnb and Discord and Reddit, as well as ones that are not well-known street names yet, but that are on their way. And prior to this role, she held various compensation positions at major corporations like Visa and Raytheon. Panelists, welcome. Thank you so much for being here. Okay, so let's get into the meat of this. Why are we here? We are here to talk about what people are doing wrong from a compensation perspective, and by people, I mean the people that work at companies, that impact the employee life cycle. And, I think the stats tell a pretty clear story on this page, but really at a high level, why this matters is it's still a candidate market out there, right? Where candidates can still move around a lot. They're still very much in demand. And at the same time, a lot of companies have frozen hiring, or they've been advised by their investors that they need to have a lot of cash in the bank. So they're really, really being thoughtful about what headcount means. And as we approach what is typically a season that some companies call focal review, some call performance management or merit cycles, a lot of folks are thinking not just about how do I get top talent that's going to stay with my company for a long time, because a lot of money is invested at the front end to get those folks in the door, but also how do I keep them? And so the conversation today, we've got great expertise from different lenses: the employee lens, the CPO lens, the recruiting lens, a variety of other lenses, to talk all about this topic. So before we dive into the 5 different stages of the employee life cycle, I'd love to hear from the panel anything I missed and why we're here and why this matters, like from your unique vantage point, and why this is such a unique place and time. I should probably
Well,
have called on someone. Yes, please.
yeah. So I just echo what you said, Caitlin, that even though a lot of companies are laying off right now, and so it may seem like you don't have to work as hard to retain your people, good people are always going to get a job, and they're always going to be sought after. And so retention is still really important, and actually more important now than ever before, because you want your people that are mission critical to your operation to stay. So, and I think that everybody who's on this call recognizes that, and that's why they tuned into this webinar. So, you know, you're already ahead of the game right now if you join the webinar.
Really well said. Thanks, Trianza.
Yeah, I'll jump in and say, you know, there's been obviously a lot of tumult in the market lately, and having been around for a little while, I've seen downturns before. This is certainly a unique one with the kind of work from home dynamic that came in the last mini downturn, and the ubiquity now of remote work. But you know, it seems like every day the headlines contain a new company that is laying people off, but it doesn't. That is sort of one part of the entire story. That's not the entire story. Certainly a lot of VC deals still happening, certainly a lot of hiring still happening. And you know, compensation is one of the top factors that any employee is going to be considering in whether to stay in their current role on their current path or to seek something else. And so, you know, I think it's a topic definitely worth exploring. Thanks for having us, Caitlin.
My pleasure. Thank you for being here, Zay. And I think that's really well said and is a good reminder. Some of us have that muscle memory from past experiences, right? We had that a few years ago. There was one 2008 and 2009. So a lot of good things that can be shared here from that prior experience. All right, let's get into the nuts and bolts then. So just setting the stage, the 5 phases of the employee life cycle that we're going to talk about, and the compensation quote sins that happen at each. For every stage, we're going to talk about what are the things that can be done wrong, what are the things that can be done right, the do's and the don'ts. And then, as about half of our audience already knows, because you're free users of our platform, all these things are ones that can be solved in ways on the OpenComp platform. So we'll talk very briefly about how that can happen so you can act on what you hear today. All right, so diving in, the first step that we're going to talk about is the interview process. And Jose, I would love if you can kick us off here, because this is your bread and butter. What do you see being the do's and don'ts from your 20 years of experience?
Yeah, the first 20-decade recruiter. Yeah, I think a lot of them are kind of spelled out here. So I think the variance that exists between company types is really distinct and pronounced, especially if you're going from, say, a FANG company to an early stage startup, and cash and sort of liquid stock based compensation versus upside and equity based compensation. And so you know, sometimes those gaps are too far to close. Sometimes they're not, but having visibility into them with candidates earlier on in the process can align both sides. I think don't put it off. Don't discuss compensation last. I've certainly seen it happen where founders become enamored with a candidate only to find out that it's far too much of a gap to close. And I think that what is important is having a plan and sticking to it. And so, you know, if you're coming from a FANG company, there's a market salary for that position at that level equally. If you're going into a startup, there's a market compensation for that startup at that level. And so have good data sources. Don't rely on just one data source, and don't rely on anecdotal data sources. Like try to have a plan. And, you know, whether you plan to be at 50th or 75th or 100th percentile, any plan is better than no plan. And so those are the kind of general rules that I'd put in place. And then I'd also say that not all roles are the same. You know, if you're hiring somebody to be a cost accountant, that's probably not the same leverage as hiring someone to be your head of finance or your head of engineering. And so in certain instances, there are people of disproportionate value who may cause you to flex outside your plan more than you're comfortable, especially at early stage. And so just be aware of that and understand sort of the limits that you're willing to go. And again, what your strategy and approach should be from the get-go.
Really well said. And I think I'm curious, Owen, to hear from that what we hear from managers or from candidates and employees, like on the flip side, if that's not something that people are doing in the interview process, what is it like to, not have just compensation discussed up front, or not be given information around where the data was collected or how the philosophy was applied?
Yeah, well, it can be really difficult when you're in that situation, because ultimately, the longer you go without having that discussion, the more pronounced that thought is going to be from the employee standpoint, right? Why haven't we talked about compensation? What is the compensation going to be? Where is it coming from? So there's a lot of building, I think, of focus from an employee standpoint as you go farther, and there can be, I don't want to say panic, but it doesn't feel good when that hasn't come up. And then on the flip side of that, if you do have that discussion early and you have a really firm understanding of maybe not even the exact number, but how are you going to get to the number? What is it based in? What are you defining as your compensation philosophy? You can alleviate a lot of that stress. And I think from an employee standpoint, you'll interview better, you'll be happier with the company, and there will be a lot more just core trust built right from the get-go.
Yeah, and I think that's a really big piece that plays into where you invest the time, the resources on the front end to bring someone in the door. That's a key way to set trust up for a long-term relationship. Julia, what would you add here from what we're hearing from clients on where they're thriving or really struggling in this area around compensation?
Not so much on the interview process. I think it's all the pre-work that leads up to that interview, right? That leads up to the data that you have to use to go to market. And so it's really important that companies benchmark and level their roles before they even get there, right? Because otherwise you get there and you're kind of at the whim of like that shiny candidate one way or the other, or you're not aligned on expectations as far as level of the role, so you might underhire or overhire. So usually our biggest recommendation, and it sets you up for like a really clean process throughout, even going into once they become an employee and maintaining the understanding or the range for that role, is benchmark and level the role, understand where you're willing to flex, just like that do right there. There might be some roles that are really critical, and that you might have to go to the higher part of the range or above max, but understand that going into it, so that not every offer or every interview can be an exception. So that's kind of the key thing that I see there.
And the comment that you're making around leveling, it kind of implies that it's not done for you, which is, I think, maybe a common misconception that we could dive into around the data that's given or benchmarks given are not necessarily accurate. Why is that?
Well, there's a lot of typically work sometimes that goes into leveling, right? So you have to take a look at your data or your internal leveling rubric and say, what is the criteria that we're looking for in this role, and how does the role that we need to fill match up to that? So is it a high level individual contributor? Is it a director but has a team? And so having that shared language within the company of what the expectations are from a skills, knowledge, experience, scope perspective is really important, and sets the comp for that role.
Thank you. And Treyanza, you have many skills in your suite of skills. I know equity is a passion area. How can our listeners ensure that equity is built into their interview process in ways that they may or may not be aware of?
Yeah, and I think especially as it relates to compensation, it's important to remember that compensation is more than just cash and more than just stock options. There are various things. There's benefits, there's work environment, there's time off, and different people have different situations. So different demographics have things that are more important to them than other demographics. If you're a family, if you're a parent, if you are remote, all these various things. And the interview process is the time. I mean, it's the time for the candidate to get to know the company and the company to get to know the candidate. So it's an important time where you can suss out what really is important to this person. And then when you get to the offer stage, you are better prepared to make them an offer that aligns with what they value, and get them to accept your offer.
Yes, and that information symmetry, I think, is something that's really missing in the market in both the interview and the offer process. Great. Let's talk about how this can be addressed in our product, and then we'll move on to the offer stage.
Cool. So within OpenComp, the piece of our product that really addresses this interview stage is Range Builder. And what Range Builder is it allows you to create professional grade pay ranges, which are essentially the basis for your compensation strategy, based in the most up-to-date market data that's available and the most relevant market data for your specific company. At the beginning of Range Builder, you'll be brought through a three-step guided onboarding. And that guided onboarding takes you through three critical pieces of establishing your compensation strategy, as well as the reasoning behind behind the specific choices that you would make. Where this really plays out and where this is very important is that it allows you to understand and educate both your organization as well as a potential candidate on the decisions and the impact of your compensation strategy. So it's that level of transparency of this is why we're going to compensate a specific way, and this is how this could potentially impact you as an employee at this company. It also allows you to establish those guardrails around what you're willing to compensate. And that can be either very tight guardrails, firm guardrails that really protect every single position and lock them into a specific range, or you can have flexibility where you want to have flexibility based on a customized strategy. So it's that core foundational piece of kind of setting everything up and being able to communicate why you're doing the things that you do as a company.
Wonderful, thank you. And thanks for the shout out, Trav. Moving on from the interview process to the actual offer process, which of course is where the interview process is directed. I'll throw this out generally for whoever wants to start, but let's start with the don'ts. What do we see companies doing wrong, whether it's intentional or not? My guess would be it's mostly unintentional.
Yeah, unintentional. You know, I think the big one that I shared is what I see is founders. In our case, we work mostly with founders getting really excited about a candidate and rushing to offer sort of when they're ready to make the offer, as opposed to when the candidate is ready to receive the offer. And so just because the candidate has completed all the steps in the process doesn't mean that they're ready to receive the offer. They may have concerns, they may have more conversations or questions to address before moving forward to that final stage. And so just being aligned with the candidate, understanding where they're at mentally, asking about remaining concerns or questions before getting there, not getting there prematurely, I think is the correct way to do it. And you know, I think the other thing to keep in mind is that the candidate may have other timelines that they're considering. They may have competing offers. They may have other opinions on the decision, specifically their partner. Myself, I'm married. I don't make career decisions without consulting my partner. And so, you know, these things all would have to happen for most people before they're ready to be in a position to accept an offer. I've heard from many people that they don't even like to send the offer letter until they've had a verbal commit from a candidate so that they know that they're aligned or at least in the neighborhood. That's the kind of main advice there. I would also say that the candidate may value, to Trans's point earlier, the candidate may value different aspects of the offer package. And so again, aligning with them, understanding where their head is at will allow you to move the various levers to create the best package that works for them.
Yeah, and if I can add something here, I think a don't is to not let your unconscious bias slip in here. So we just talked about how different demographics have different priorities, but that's actually not something for you to decide. So, you know, we just saw an article from HBR last week about how the disparity in compensation, the gender pay disparity, shows up within 3 years of somebody graduating from college. So really early on, something's happening there where women are getting paid less than men for same job, same performance, whatever, early on. And, you know, when we are making an offer, you know, aside from gender biases and race biases, there are other biases like the similarity bias. Somebody went to the same school that I did or had a similar experience or worked at a company that I did. And that puts a value in my mind that shapes how I'm structuring the offer. So just being aware of these unconscious biases, and you know, they show up throughout the whole employee life cycle. We'll talk about them a little bit more later. But even at the offer stage, before you even know the person, just, you know, have a system that helps double check that you're not letting some biases slip in when you're putting an offer together.
Mhm. Yeah, that's really, really well said. And we've had a question too from the audience that Scott asked it in the context of like, what's the source of the market data for pay ranges or for range builder, which Owen just walked us through. But I think it's a actually generally applicable question, and Julia and Owen, maybe you can take this, but what do candidates or do people not as or professionals, pardon me, not know about the accuracy or the freshness or the specificity of their data that might actually get them in trouble in this part of the process?
Yeah, I mean, that's a big one, right? But I think that goes to knowing where your ranges come from and your comp philosophy, and understanding, okay, our data is based on these things. We are targeting this peer group and this percentile of the market and X, X, and X, to really be able to educate. And this kind of goes with both sides, like educate about cash and educate about equity too, because a lot of times equity is a really big portion of that offer and people just breeze on by and leave it there as far as number of shares. So you really, as far as your data, you want to make sure that it's updated regularly, QA'd, validated by a third party. And, you know, we talk about this a lot at Open Comp. That does somewhat lead to a lot of companies have access to that kind of data, but a lot of candidates don't. They might be able to only search on Glassdoor or on PayScale or whatever else other resources out there. And so in the offer, reiterating your compensation philosophy, where you get your data from, is really key, so that they feel also equipped that they're evaluating an offer that's been thought through and is accurate for their role.
Yeah, thank you. And Liza, I'll answer your question in just a moment as well, but piggybacking onto what Julia said, this was a big aha for me when I first got into this compensation space, was the fact that most companies are relying on, you know, either kind of input from peers, or they're getting compensation surveys from vendors where the data is 6 to 12 to 18 months stale by the time it's actually published, right? And if you think about how fast the world has changed, even in the last 6 months, that's really archaic information, right? So that's, you need something that's effectively real time. So look for a vendor that is that has real-time integrations with your HRIS system, or reflects the details from other people's HRIS systems and equity providers, because that's really a good source of truth. The question that Liza asked specifically to the panel is, how detailed does compensation have to be, or how do we recommend getting started? And I think, you know, let me put it this way from my perspective, and then you guys, the experts, can expound on it. There's a couple of different vectors. There's company size, right? Like funding stage. There's also industry, and there's also location. And without that information, you might be comparing your compensation as a Series A company to Google, or, you know, your company in St. Louis with San Francisco, right? Those are not necessarily comparable pieces of data. So I'll throw that out for folks to add on to there.
I think she clarified on comp philosophy, so I can go into that a little bit, because a lot of people ask. I'd say compensation transparency is a bit of a spectrum for companies. So you want to have your managers and employees feel equipped to even receive specificity in a lot of these things. There are varying layers. So there's sometimes a comp statement that's kind of general, that talks about your values and culture surrounding rewards at the company, whether you're a pay for performance company, whether you value internal equity. Hopefully they all do. But they can talk about all of those things, but then they can go into further details around like their peer group or the market data they use. Sometimes companies go into the exact percentiles that they might target as a company, but sometimes I feel like that might back you into a corner, because your strategy might change over time, right? So if you say you're targeting 75th percentile this year, but then you go back and next year you say 50th, people are like, what changed? So you have to be, it's totally fine, but you have to be prepared to talk about the business conditions that led to that decision. You also probably want to talk about the ongoing programs that really help carry out that compensation philosophy. So are you reviewing your pay ranges once a year or every 6 months? Are you evaluating employee compensation annually? How do you think about promotions, bonuses, additional LTI grants? So all of those programmatic things are also really helpful to spell out for employees.
Yeah, I totally agree with everything that Julia just said, especially that the market does move. So your philosophy is their guideposts, but you don't want to have too many rules in there because, ideally you're looking at comp every 6 months. That's what I recommend, so that you can make adjustments, and don't be afraid to adjust your philosophy if it doesn't work for you anymore, because that's kind of the worst thing that you can do is, be rigid around your philosophy because you spent so much time creating it. And then you realize the market's over here and you're not able to recruit people, or you're not able to compensate your people appropriately. So, not so detailed that it inhibits your flexibility, but enough that it gives you guidelines so that you're able to do something which is defensible and that you can be transparent about it with your team.
I think it also just depends on what types of employees you're trying to hire. Some have one type of software engineer they're trying to hire, whereas others may have 10 or 12 with different degrees of sort of how in demand, how rare their skill sets are, and how they're compensated. And so some by necessity are forced into multiple classifications, whereas others would be safer with fewer.
Thank you, everybody. Bringing it back to this topic, I don't think one point we have touched on enough is the point around trade-off between cash and equity. Why is that something to be really careful and cautious with?
In my experience, when I see companies offering more than one version of an offer, higher cash and higher equity, candidate sees the higher ranges for all of them and then wants the top band for everything. And so you sort of inherently build in some type of disappointment for the candidate, whereas you're offering options, you're also offering sort of a less ideal version of one of those categories in any of the scenarios. And so I think it also will, if you're looking to be equitable, that will result in biases of other types. Candidates who are less sophisticated about equity won't ask questions about equity, will then receive less of it, which in the long term may affect their overall compensation take home. And so there's really an opportunity for companies to educate candidates about the equity that they're receiving. And some may already know everything. I found even executives sometimes need some coaching around very specific equity questions. And so I think if you build that education into your process, you create trust with candidates. I think that's a good way to get to the heart of what they're needing, and avoid that sort of either or offer scenario where you've got two different versions of the same offer.
100%. And I would also add, it's one of the other tricky things with that is if you allow too much trade-off, or if you don't have a good record keeping system of who took trade-offs, you could end up with people taking lower base and higher equity, and then in the next year, maybe the HR team is turned over or people forgot who took that. And so they look low in comparison to the range. And so they're brought up, right? But that was actually a distinct decision that they made. And so now they're at a higher salary and have way more equity than someone who chose the other amount. So always something to keep in mind there. I always used to joke with my friends that if you have an offer that has two, always take lower cash and higher equity, because they'll forget over time and give you more money. So that's typically.
You heard it here first.
Yeah,
that's good.
I mean, I've certainly done that. I've been at companies where we did that, where we gave, offer choice. And what I've done more recently, though, is spent more time understanding from the candidate and the interview process what's important to them, so that when we get to the offer, I know equity is going to play a big role in their decision here, or cash is more important to them. And also, when you're a manager and you're working out an offer, it's a range. So, you do have some play in there, hopefully on the equity side and on the cash side. So if you present an offer to somebody and they're like, I was really hoping for a little bit more on the cash side, hopefully your people ops team is giving you a range that you can work with, so that you're not hamstrung with an offer that's not going to be accepted.
Yeah, no, really well said. And on the candidate side, what are things that need to be kept in mind here, and how do we do that in the product?
Yeah, so I think one thing to go back to is really that piece around equity education. It can be difficult as a candidate to evaluate multiple offers without the correct context. And oftentimes you're not given enough information around equity to evaluate like for like. So as an employer, if you do step into that realm of, giving that piece of education, it can be a huge trust building moment to say that, you really care about me making the correct decision for myself. And then from a product perspective, this goes to a new tool that we're going to be launching in the fall, which is called Intelligent Offers. So Intelligent Offers is an end-to-end offer tool that kind of builds directly all the way from the first point of developing and deploying your compensation strategy across your company, all the way through to communicating that level of transparency with a candidate. And the way that it does that is it fully integrates with Range Builder, so that once you produce your ranges, those ranges can be deployed at the point of decision to your recruiters and your hiring managers so that they understand the standard options that exist for compensation packages. That really helps you keep your team aligned on compensation decisions, and it addresses that piece of eliminating industry or experience bias because you're given point of decision information around what is the correct offer for a specific role and level. There's also a large analytics piece that will exist in the tool that will go through historical offers and their acceptance and rejection rates. So that helps your recruiters understand what is likely to be the most effective offer given and what's likely to close a candidate. And that goes back to the piece that we spoke about earlier around, you don't want to give an offer too soon, but you also have to be realistic that candidates might be entertaining multiple offers while you're interviewing them, and you also don't want to be last. So you do want to be prepared to understand what is most likely to land and be able to deliver that offer to your candidate when they're ready to accept it. And then the final piece of this tool, which will kind of interact with that employee experience, is that it'll actually generate an offer letter for the potential candidate, potential employee, that goes through the what and why of how their offer was generated, as well as a full summary so that they can look at that in front of themselves and use it as a piece to evaluate compensation holistically. So there's that trust piece to say, we're going to give you all the information that you need to really evaluate this offer, because we want you to make the decision that's going to be right for you.
When I was working at a large company, giving an offer and then also going through merit cycles was probably one of the hardest parts of my job, because decisions were made about compensation that I had to tell my team about but couldn't explain. And I think that experience for me really underscores a lot of the value here, which is like HR leaders, professionals, or comp professionals spend so much time on compensation planning, compensation strategy, and making sure that they can pay competitively, fairly in ways that work financially for the business, and then are largely dependent upon the decisions that managers and recruiters make in the moment to send offers and things along those lines. So really, I think there's a large opportunity here for empowering the team, so to speak, in this way. One question that's come up before we move on, that's I think a good one, it will have a large appeal for other folks, is the question of what an appropriate ratio for cash and equity is as a trade-off. And the question is like, does 1-to-1 make sense? Like, how do you think through that? It's probably really hard to answer. We're going to throw it out there anyways.
Yeah, I'll take a stab at this. It really depends on how you value your equity. And like, certainly every founder thinks their equity is going to be very, very valuable one day. If you didn't, you probably wouldn't have the self-belief to start a company. But there's also sort of like the early stage companies present equity, and they talk about it in terms of percentages of the company. You're going to come in, you're going to get 0.5% of the company, or 1% of the company, or what have you. And then after a company gets to a certain point of maturity, they stop doing that. They start talking about the equity in dollar value, and they say, okay, you're going to get 100K in equity, or you're going to get 200K in equity. And that, just because they've started talking about it in cash doesn't mean that it's more likely to become cash, right? It's sort of a philosophical and a strategic choice of when you decide to do that. There's also the choice of when you go from ISOs, incentive stock options, to RSUs, restricted stock units, and the sort of rules there. And I think ratios would really depend on those scenario details. Like, what stage are you at? How are you communicating the value of your shares? How do you talk about the upside scenario? Are you modeling are you compensating people based on what this will look like in 5 years? Are you compensating people based on what this looks like today? And do you have your sort of messaging set around that strategy? And so I don't know that I could offer one static ratio, but I think that the later stage a company goes, the more that ratio becomes well-defined, and the smaller the ratio becomes of equity to cash, to the point where you get to public companies. And I think it's the same way, but then it moves up the ladder. The more senior you get, the higher percentage in equity you get, to the point where senior leadership are getting multiples of their cash compensation and equity. So it's really kind of all over the map.
Great, thank you. Okay, so we're going to move on to the next part of the process. So at this point, our candidate has become an employee. They've been there at least 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, and we're now in the quarterly review process. Now, this part of the process does not always involve compensation. That might come up in a merit cycle part of the employee life cycle. However, you manage millennials, you manage anyone, they want feedback, and that's a very valuable part of the process, right? So Trianza, would you mind starting us out here on the don'ts and the do's that you've seen in your experience?
Yeah, so I certainly agree with what is on this slide. And one thing that I've done in my experience is done a promotion cycle on a quarterly basis, so that you're doing your talent assessment and you're understanding what the talent is that you have in your company, and you have an opportunity to actually do something about it, because you're not going to do salary reviews every 3 months. You're going to do those every 6 months, or maybe every year. But promotions you can do more regularly. And for the most part, promotions do come with a comp increase. There's a way of thinking about that. And one thing, which is a do, is to have a strategy for how you're going to think about comp increases with promotions. And that's part of your compensation philosophy, but specifically with the quarterly review, understand, are you going to give people 7 to 10% increase because they're being promoted? Is your philosophy going to be, I'm going to get them into the 20th percentile, the 25th percentile of the new range? Whatever it is, have a way of thinking about it, because again, that's how you are able to do things that are defensible and free of bias, when you have some guidelines and you're applying those consistently across all of your promotions, across all of your teams. And agree, don't skip the quarterly review. It's some work for sure. And the larger your company is, the more work it is. But it's really a great time for the leadership team to sit down and just talk about who's on their team, and comp aside, who do we want to give opportunities to? Who is really strong on my team that I want you to know about, so that you can get them on a project, or maybe there's a role on your team that would be suitable for them. Goes back to what we were saying earlier about compensation is not just about money. So it's about development opportunities, and the quarterly review is a time for the team to sit down and figure out who our top talent is and how we get them more opportunities. So it is an important part of the process, even though it's kind of time consuming.
I'm going to jump in here because this is an area of particular passion for me right now. Something that my team's done over the course of the last 6 months or so is introduce a process where we do quarterly reviews. I collect peer reviews anonymously from the folks that they work with, aggregate it, and compose myself kind of a list of where I think their top 2 or 3 grows and glows are, meaning glows, things you're doing great, grows is where you could do even better. And then I provide the anonymous feedback as well, like in a written format that I send after the meeting. But what the actual time together looks like is really valuable. The person on the team begins by giving themselves an assessment, and it's a really great way of measuring where self-awareness is, and even hearing about like their wants and needs in terms of just things they're saying about themselves. And then we also do a 360 review for me, and then more largely for the team, and then farther concentric circle out for the organization. Like, what's one thing you would change about the team or the org? And it's been really valuable on, I think, multiple levels, and just is pretty simple to have put in place too. So really have enjoyed that. And then the folks that have been here a little bit longer, what we're finding too is that the people that have been here for, done this several times already, is it starts to get repetitive in terms of some of the feedback from peers. So we're going to try something new next time, which is where the person will pick one growth area they want to focus on in the coming 3 months. And then that will be what we share with the organization so they can give feedback about how someone might be able to do that well, knowing their skills. So pretty excited for that one too. Back to the topic and the panel. Julia, where do you see customers of ours thriving and in need of help around this particular point in time?
Quarterly reviews, I would say, thankfully, are a little bit more of a business and HR process. But I do see this is a really good opportunity to take stock of like, oh man, I brought someone in thinking they were more junior because maybe they interviewed differently, or they, I would say that's the main one. Sometimes companies bring people in without a level and they assign them after that, but that's kind of the point to say, okay, is everything as expected from the way that I brought them in? And take that opportunity to make adjustments quickly, because the last thing you want to do is notice when someone's performing at a higher level, or there was kind of a misperception on the interview process, and you want to fix that quickly versus having to wait for a 6-month annual review to make any pay changes or any corrections there. So I'd say that's the biggest part about comp where that would play in.
Thank you. Oh, and maybe we can get into the candidate experience and how to do this in the product.
Yeah, so we facilitate this level of quarterly review in the product within Range Builder. So once you've completed your onboarding, you'll land on your Range Builder homepage, which is a full analytics screen that looks through a 360-degree view of your entire org's compensation, as well as compensation down to individual levels or individual employees. And what that allows for is like-for-like comparisons across your entire organization throughout specific areas of employees. That allows you to take a look back in these quarterly reviews and say, are there any areas that I need to address in terms of pay discrepancies or performance where I need to make an immediate adjustment for someone who is performing at a level above where they were brought in, or if there is any kind of pay discrepancies that have surfaced over potential hiring throughout a quarter. And all of that is surfaced essentially automatically through the platform visually, so you can see very clearly where these different employees are falling. And all of the data that underlies that analysis is normalized. So if there's any degree of, we're comparing one employee who works in a specific geographical area versus another geographical area, you can actually compare them like for like and make that comparison immediately without any manual effort. So it's a really efficient tool to go through and say on a quarterly basis as you're doing these reviews, how do I audit my entire company with a full view of all the employees in aggregate? And then where do I need to make adjustments quickly?
Awesome. Thank you. All right, so then let's get into merit cycles and focal reviews, and would love to talk about this through the lens of what are the compensation sins, and with a particular focus in this one on equity, right? How do we make sure that this is consistent and fair? So whoever, I'd throw it out to the group, who wants to begin on this one?
I can start because I've run many of these from a compensation perspective. So I think the biggest misstep is going into it without guidelines for people to lean on for making decisions. And I think the business usually wants guidelines to help make them make decisions. Hopefully you're running a really good performance management process that allows the managers or decision makers as far as budget to have the inputs to be able to make decisions on their employees and actually calibrate amongst others. Ideally also calibration is a factor so that you're making sure that not just one person thinks that they're a rock star, but it's apparent across teams and decisions are being made fairly. So I'd say having guidelines and calibration are kind of two really big pieces there.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Having a defensible strategy, which means you've done your comp philosophy, you understand like what the guidelines are that you're working with the merit cycle is really important. And it's especially important now, you know, we've had legislation about transparency in pay ranges, and that's important for when we're hiring people, but it's also important when we're doing our merit cycles, because it's ushering in a new age of transparency. And so people want to know, employees want to know that there was a process, and what was the process, and what were the criteria that I was being evaluated on for you to determine what my annual increase or what my stock option refreshes or whatever. So you need to be able to answer that. You know, I have what I call the printer rule, which is, it doesn't apply anymore because everybody works from home and everything is digital. But back in the day, we used to have paper. And the printer rule was, if somebody left the company compensation report on the printer, and some employee saw it and asked about it, could you defend each one of those compensation decisions? Well, if you didn't have a strategy and a philosophy and guidelines, and the other important thing is to be sure you train your managers. Don't let this just be something that came from the people ops team and you just handed it to your managers, and then your managers have to, you know, talk to their employees about stuff that they don't understand. That's not good. So management training is important, and to be able to pass the printer rule. The other thing that I wanted to add on this is around, you know, we talked about unconscious bias before, and that comes into play here too. That we naturally gravitate towards, you know, what's familiar. And one of the things that people are struggling with now is in the hybrid workplace that we have, that, you know, if you're a manager and you're in office and there are people that are in office with you that you're seeing and working with, you know, every day, and then there's your remote employees that you don't see. And there's a concern that the people who you have proximity with are going to be valued more highly by you than the people that you don't see every day. That's an unconscious bias. So, you know, I think training managers on that and managers being aware of those. There's another couple that I just wanted to bring up that aren't that common, that are important for people to think about. Something called the contrast effect. So the contrast effect is that you judge people or things in comparison to other things around them rather than on their own merits. So you may have a team full of absolute superstars, and you have one person who actually is very good. But when you look at that person in comparison to the other people, they don't look so great. Well, you know, is that fair, or is that the contrast effect, that they're just not looking great in comparison to the other people when actually they're doing a great job? It can be positive, it can be a negative contrast effect as well. The other one that I wanted to talk about is called decision fatigue. And decision fatigue is, there was a study done in 2011 called the Hungry Judge Study, and it was about these judges. They were deciding on parole hearings, and what they found is that they would start off, you know, a lot of positive outcomes, and then the closer it got to lunch, the more negative outcomes, and then after lunch, there were more positive outcomes again, and that's why they call it the Hungry Judge effect. So the point of this was, where you are, how you're feeling, has a direct impact on the decisions that you're making, in this case around people's compensation. So also through the week, tip for people who might be looking for a job: try not to schedule interviews on Fridays, because the interviewer is tired and they just want to get to their weekend, and they risk not seeing you as favorably as if you were at the beginning of the week. So anyway, being aware of unconscious biases, even these ones that we don't normally think about. Another thing I want to say just on the merit cycle that sometimes it's a don't, is don't forget to run a pay equity audit. And if you have a small company, it's faster, maybe harder to do because you don't have a lot of people in the same classification. But this is an important part of the merit cycle. You've done all your work and your managers have given you their recommendations and you're ready. Run a pay equity audit to make sure that inadvertently you don't have women being paid less than men or people of a certain race being paid less than other people. It's just an important part. And if you need your legal counsel to help you with that, or need some outside help with that, it's an important thing to do to make sure that you are buttoned up with your merit cycle and that you don't have any inadvertent outcomes happening.
Clearly knowledgeable in this area. Thank you. Oh, and as an employee in this process, what are hallmarks of things that give you confidence and set you up for wanting to be a continued member of the team?
Yeah, I think a big piece of it for sure is having that standardized criteria and really understanding as an employee what's expected of me and what is exceeding expectations. So having a clear view to say going into my merit cycle or an adjustment period, I can fairly evaluate myself and work towards those goals is so helpful. And I also think that piece around decisions not being made in a vacuum. So understanding the process that underlies merit adjustments is actually a really great thing for an employee to know, because they understand the process that leads to a potential increase in compensation and the review that they're getting. So it allows you that level of transparency to understand exactly how you're getting from point A to point B and not question, why a certain outcome went a certain way.
Yeah, well said. And I think that's definitely something that, at least in my experience, is an area where HR leaders can equip their hiring managers better than traditionally. All right, just in the interest of time, in 30 seconds or less, can you tell us about how this is done in the product, and then we'll close out with company milestones?
Yes, so we can talk about how this will be done in the product. So Adjustments is an upcoming tool that we'll be launching right after Intelligent Offers. And it will allow you to deliver pay adjustments based on standardized guidelines and criteria that you as an organization decide to set. Additionally, it'll allow you to seamlessly collaborate with your leadership team within the app. So you can set a process as well that will follow those standardized guidelines and criteria to make sure that you're completely aligned on how you are going to adjust your employees. It also allows you from a budgeting perspective to hold firm to your budgeting and maintain your financial health by seeing where you're allocating dollars for adjustments. And by defining what your adjustments are as well, whether it's a merit increase or a promotion or any other adjustment that you might want to make. You can also see specifically where your dollars are going in terms of the effect on the employees. So it'll be launching soon. We're very excited about it.
Thank you. Thank you. All right, so closing things out, company milestones, and this includes everything like M&A or a new round of funding or all sorts of different things. Julia, I'm going to ask this question now, just hoping that you can answer it as we talk through this topic. There's a question from Tina as to how often philosophy and ranges should be updated. And I think that it doesn't fit just into this portion, but is definitely something that ladders up here. So maybe you can kick us off and cover off on that too.
Sure. So philosophy, that typically, at least in pre-IPO companies, a lot of times will change with fundraising. So you might have more cash on hand, so you're able to kind of prioritize spend there, whereas on you might have taken on more dilution, and so you might be a little bit under the gun on your equity spend. That's one, but also, companies go through different maturity levels with their leadership teams, et cetera, to where they might have different values that evolve over time, or there might also be company stages where you're trying to find product market fit, or you have product market fit, but now you're going out for market share. So that also changes your makeup of how you need to recruit, et cetera. So that also changes your comp philosophy. So I'd say those are kind of the two biggest ones. Of course, anything else like moving to a whole new remote strategy, that'll change it. As far as updating your compensation ranges, I'd say kind of this standard is looking at your holistic compensation ranges annually, but you might do tests in the market every either 6 months to see if there's any market movement, or a lot of times some of those ad hoc checks come up from the business as well, to where they're like, I just feel like these ranges are not right, I cannot hire. So you also get those like sporadic throughout the year checks that are per requests of leaders. So I would say for sure, once a year, check for any big shifts in the market, twice a year, and then do ad hoc evaluations as needed from the business.
Thank you. And Trianza, I know you have great international experience as part of your professional mix, and that's obviously a do and a don't in this particular phase. What would you say about that kind of expansion and how that impacts compensation?
Yeah, and when I thought about company milestones, I did think about acquisitions where you're bringing in a bunch of new people, and their ranges, whether they were domestic or international, may not match yours. And so it is important to make sure that the people you've acquired, you're not treating them like second-class citizens. So you may need to adjust them into your new ranges. And if you're acquiring people in a new geography or internationally, it is worth it to pay to get that international data. You can't really guess because you really don't know. And the compensation structures may be different. So, you know, benefits may or may not play heavily in a compensation package in, you know, in a socialized company that has socialized medicine as it would in the US. And so you need a new framework to think about, how do I pay people in these different geographies, in these different countries? And it's worth it to get the market. I always recommend getting the market data so that you can feel confident in how you're paying people, particularly if you've acquired like a small little company that didn't have data. So they were just kind of, you know, doing this to decide how to pay people. Employees actually expect that now that they're being subsumed by a larger company, that it's going to be more formalized and standardized, and that it's going to be based on data. So, you know, as we said, new era of transparency. People are less willing to just take your word for it. So do yourself a favor, get the data.
My husband was in M&A for a while, and one commonality after whenever a company would get acquired was just a lot of nervousness around job security and around compensation. And I think that, you know, data can really solve a lot of those emotional worries, right? Where you can really ground people in facts and give them that kind of tool.
Yeah.
Right. We're almost at time. Yes, Mandy, it is difficult to be in M&A. All right, let's Owen close us out, please, and then we'll bring us home on how this happens in our platform. And folks, if you haven't seen the message that I just sent, you can sign up for the product at app.opencomp.com/signup or email our sales team to get involved in the betas of the products we've been sharing.
Yeah, so really, I would just double down on that level of data-backed decision making and having an understanding and a communication, intentful communication around how growth of your organization is going to impact your current employees. And where you see this playing out in app for OpenComp is actually in our Market Pulse data set. So we source all of our data directly from our thousands of customers and then segment that data so that you can apply it directly to your specific company and allow you to update your data as you mature and as you make changes. It's also fully integrated across the entire platform. So as you make those changes, as your company grows, you can adjust your pay ranges and any modeling that you've done in just a number of clicks. So we'll say 4 clicks, update the data that you want, and then 3 clicks to upgrade your ranges, and you're right where you need to be for your new status. It's also going to update all of the analytics that exist within your platform. So when you do make that decision to update your data based on the new state of your business, you won't have to do any manual work to search for areas that you should be making adjustments or to search for places where maybe people have now fallen out of range. That'll be surfaced for you directly, so you can see that visually, or you can see it tab on a table form, and you can go through and make sure that you can make the adjustments that you need to make.
Thanks, Owen. All right, I'm putting the speakers on the spot with something I didn't prepare them for, but if there's one thing that you want the audience to take away from today, what is it?
Well, I'll start. Data is your friend. So use data, get data, have a structure, have a philosophy, and be aware of your biases.
I would say data leads to transparency, which builds trust. And I think that that's sort of at the heart of the solution here, but certainly at the heart of successful recruiting as well.
I would say consistency is key when it comes to compensation. So make sure that you're making decisions that are aligned with some guidelines that you guys have all agreed upon as a company, and lead with those so that you're making equitable decisions.
And I would say compensation tools are definitely your friend. Look for something that's end to end, make sure that it's integrated across your entire compensation philosophy and speaks to each other so that you have that level of integration across your entire plan, and you make sure that you're staying on path.
And I would say thank you for being here. Thank you to our speakers, and we will see you next month. Have a good day, everybody.